we've got a global audience joining us today, so appreciate everybody participating in this webinar. My name is Eric Bush. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Demand Driven Technologies and delighted to be your host for today's session. A couple footnotes before we get started. First of all, that the webinar is recorded. We make that recording available to attendees so you can review afterwards and share the link with other colleagues if you have interest to do that. We'll also be sending out a copy of the presentation materials during that are utilized in the webinar for your reference as well. We keep everyone in listen-only mode, but there is a question and answer feature on your Zoom control panel. So would appreciate if you would utilize that to ask questions along the way. And then one final note is we're using a polling feature. So we appreciate getting end user feedback as we go through our content. So we're going to be asking a series of questions twice during the webinar, 3 and then 2, and would love to have your feedback on those questions, and we'll share kind of the results when we issue those polls. All right, so let's get started. So from an agenda standpoint, we'll start with a little bit of a view on some of the market realities that are driving our focus at Demand Driven Technologies, and some observations that we have about that really are influencing significantly our software development strategies and focus. We're going to focus today a lot on the topic of safety stock, red zones, however you want to think about it, and how we can better improve the ability to create settings that are reliable and viable for us. So at the end of the webinar, you should have a sense of the functionality that our autopilot feature provides and how it can really simplify that task and give you more confidence that the settings that you're getting are correct and really avoid some of that manual effort that's involved in that. We'll talk about some of the limitations of the current conventions that are available in the market around safety stock and some of the drawbacks that those pose to us. And then we'll talk about how we've developed this autopilot feature. We've been in the development cycle on this for a bit over 2 years now, and it's been a heavily involved process with a lot of customer influence and input. And we'll talk about how we went through that, the lessons learned that we went through, and then we'll follow that with a demonstration. We could talk about next steps and closing comments at the end. Again, we're going to be doing some polling questions here as we go through, so your participation in those would be greatly appreciated. This is the slide that kind of is my focus every day. It's a look at U.S. manufacturing inventory to sales ratio. So it's effectively inventory turnover rates over the past 25 years, the period from 1995 to 2020. And as you can see here, it's essentially flat, which is a bit of a mind boggler because, you know, while we did gain some ground in the kind of heady economic times leading up to the big recession in the 08, 09, 10 kind of period, you can see that we've really exited now 2021, 22 at the same place we were all those years ago. And one noticeable blip here at the beginning of the pandemic before companies were able to get back to work and the like. And this is kind of startling to think about because there's $1 trillion of inventory in U.S. manufacturing. And my goodness, if we could only have achieved like a 5 or 7 or 10% improvement, if we gained 10% on $1 trillion, that would be freeing up $100 billion of working capital that companies could better utilize to strategically move their company forward, invest in more capacity, other factors like that. Why are we using that money to invest in collecting dust instead of driving our supply chain performance earlier? This to me is an indication that there's a lot of room for improvement in how we do material planning and inventory planning. And so it's our goal in our software development efforts, our work with our clients to help ensure that they get better results. Now, the reality is that the software in itself is complex, and I liken it to the Apollo space capsule, where the users are really confronted with a vast array of switches, buttons, knobs, you name it, configuration settings that they need to get right to get value out of the system. Back in the 70s, when the astronauts were flying to the moon and back in the Apollo capsule, it was only the best of the best of the best that were able to make that journey. It was highly, highly dependent on their skills, their ability to change configurations and do things on the journey to the moon and back to make that journey safe. And it seems like a lot of the software that we're using out there, whether it's in ERP environments or specific supply chain planning environments, puts way too much onus on the user to be able to be the master of all of those settings. And so we'd like to really try and take a crack at making that better. So typically, people will use some form of safety stock method that's dependent on statistics. If you Google these kind of terms on the internet, you'll find countless examples of safety stock formulas that can be utilized for all sorts of different patterns. A lot of that is mathematical notation that I'm not even too good at being able to understand and interpret. And this is one of the flaws. And then when we talk to other clients, we'll find that, well, they've got kind of a manual process they use. They kind of try to estimate how many days supply they want to have on hand at all times. But suffice to say, it's a rather challenging environment. In our solution, Intuiflow, we've implemented a statistical way of setting demand-driven MRP or DDMRP buffers. And that uses a Z-score, kind of that you saw here in the statistical methods. We utilize that. We thought it might give us and our clients some additional benefits. In some ways, it works. In other ways, it was problematic. The biggest issue we saw was that the statistical methods, because that Z-score factor is so sensitive to aberrations in your demand history, in other words, you get an outlier or a large demand pulse, that their buffer zones were jumping around quite a bit and making it difficult for them to get confidence in the system. The DDMRP published approach is to use inventory or lead time ranges to set what's called the red zone base, which is kind of the foundation of the red zone in a DDMRP buffer. And by setting lead time ranges, we set the amount of base, which would be the percentage of usage over the lead time that goes into that element of the red zone in a DDMRP buffer. And then that would be coupled with a safety factor based on COV ranges. So coefficients of variation from 1 to 50, 51 to 100, et cetera, would add additional safety coverage into that red zone base and getting you good, better settings. This method has worked incredibly well for our clients over the years, even well before, obviously, the advent of the autopilot kind of feature or anything like that. And client after client after client of ours and our competitors were seeing that they were able to get better inventory performance, better on-time order fill rates by utilizing this scheme, which was really designed to help make it a bit easier to administer and utilize. You just craft the settings for the different lead time and variation ranges, and you get good value from those buffer settings. But what we found along the way, now this is part of how we work with every client that we engage with, is we do simulations with them of how their items would perform utilizing DDMRP buffering logic. The idea being that if we can illustrate that there is a tangible improvement in the inventory levels or tangible improvement in the service levels, that the clients would gain confidence in the solution and would adopt Intuiflow for their planning environment. And that simulation process has worked very well. What we did discover, though, was that items with the exact same coefficient of variation, in this case 130%, would actually require different red zone or safety zone values. And you can see that on these graphics over here to the right and with the values in the middle here. At the bottom, we have a red zone factor of 23% of the usage over the lead time. So it's about 1/4 the size of the yellow zone. In the middle case, it's about equal to the yellow zone size. So you can see very similar ratios between red and yellow in that example. And in the top example, you can see a much fatter red zone required to ensure 100% service in that example. What we were seeing is that there were two major factors. One is that the pattern of demand, even though these score out statistically to the same coefficient of variation, you can see just by looking at the pictures that they're not behaving the same way. And this was really a bit of a eye opener in the sense that we understood then that, hey, in some of these cases, our method that we're using from a DDMRP standpoint is giving us great results, but in some cases, we're either overcompensating or undercompensating when we get those red zone values. And again, what we're after is getting it to a point where the user can have more confidence that the settings that they have are actually going to work for them. So one factor was the pattern, right? And we'll talk about Shazam here in a minute, the music app. But recognizing that it's not necessarily mathematical formulas that can tell us the right answer. It's something that's actually more of a visual or a pattern recognition story that we need to focus on. The other side of it was that we understood that, boy, there's some item attributes, most specifically the lead time of the items, as well as whatever minimum order quantity or order cycle or effectively the size of the green zone would represent. Items with very large green zones, meaning they have a very large MOQ relative to the rate of usage, carry a lot of built-in safety in them already. And you can see here, you've got a very heavy green zone. We're up with inventory in the green zone most of the time and only rather infrequently dipping down to where we need to trigger a reorder. In this case, we trigger 4 resupply orders over the course of the year, and the same in the story below that. And so that green zone size, the lead time factor, this item has a longer lead time. The purple line represents when we generated a supply order. The black line represents when the inventory arrived. And you can see this range is longer than this range and much, much longer than this range, which is very, very short. This is a very short lead time item. And that really kind of told us that we need to think about this in a more broader way. Each of the previous methods, whether it's safety stock, statistical formulas, they involve lead time, they involve some of these elements as well. But again, they're not picking up the pattern recognition. Those elements also play in from a DDMRP buffer setting standpoint. So this became kind of the problem statement and what we saw as an opportunity to maybe take one of those switches out of the Apollo capsule by providing a solution that gives you the right results in a way that is visual, gains confidence of the users, and at the end of the day, ensures you get the right kind of performance out of your stock positions. This is just another illustration from a larger set of parts. Each of these vertical lines kind of represent a coefficient of variation range. We put an upper boundary of 500% of the red zone as a limit, but you can see here that there is, even within each of these ranges, a vast bandwidth of different values that we're getting for the red zone factor. Some here are very low, others are extremely high. So we knew we were on the right path if we could come up with a better tool to address this. And that's where I mentioned Shazam. If you're not familiar, Shazam is a music app you can download on your phone. And if you're hearing a song in let's say a restaurant, and you can't quite remember the artist, if you click the Shazam button, it will listen to that song. It will take the analog sound wave out of the air, digitize it, and matches it to its library of all the songs pretty much that have ever been recorded. And it'll tell you the result within seconds. It's an amazing little tool. And it'll do that regardless of what part of the song is playing. So it's some amazing technology, but it kind of said, hey, to us, if Shazam can do that, then maybe we can use pattern recognition and other kind of AI ML tools to help us get the right settings. Because if we understand the waveform of those demand pulses that an item has to go through, kind of as you saw on the left side of that chart I showed a few minutes ago, perhaps we would get to better results. So with that, we had our vision of what we wanted to do. Take a holistic approach, improve results for the users, get it to the point where they're confident in what the system's doing, more like the Dragon capsule where civilians went to outer space for a few days in cool-looking spacesuits with iPads, and that's kind of the mode that we want to be in. So let's stop here, and we're going to go ahead and launch our first polling question. Just give me a second here. I got to get to the right place on my screen. Here we go. There we go. So there's 3 questions that we're going to ask you to respond to here, and we would appreciate you answering each of them as honestly as you can, and then we'll share the results with you. Wait a couple more seconds. We're getting good answers on all 3, so if you could just continue with that, I'd appreciate it. Okay. So you can see on our first question, about 16% say they're doing it weekly, 26% monthly, 32% quarterly, 21% semi-annually, 5% none of the above. So maybe they're doing it daily, I don't know, or annually. On the second question, do you trust the effectiveness? 63% are favorable. The last time we did this kind of webinar, we had a much different result, 37% indicating they're not confident in their safety stock settings. Then the third question is, do you have the ability to test the effectiveness of your safety stock settings prior to implementation? 32% saying they do, 68% saying they do not have that capability. So appreciate that. Very useful feedback. These results are very similar, a little bit more favorable to their confidence on the safety stock settings than we saw in the previous webinar, but we appreciate your participation in that poll. So let's get back to the presentation then. So again, our vision on the autopilot here was to give us the ability to create settings for you, make it a more automated process, help get the system to do the work. As I had mentioned, we utilize a customer advisory board, and several clients helped us, notably Greif, Coca-Cola Beverages of Africa, and Aptiv, a big automotive supplier. And they really got involved in the early days because they were in a similar situation of rolling out the solution to a vast number of locations across their production network. They knew that they wanted to have more of the system helping their users so that there was less guesswork underway out there. Obviously, their involvement in their guidance on the development of the solution was really critical. We had access to their data, obviously, and could utilize that in testing. And there was quite a bit of discovery that occurred during the process that helped us, I think, craft a very, very effective solution that we're sharing with you today. There was a lot of lessons learned, and I think it's kind of good to talk about this a bit because you don't know what you don't know in some ways. We had a vision. It was based on that idea of how come we're seeing similar patterns or similar results, but we're not getting similar COV values, but we're not getting as good a results as we could. We looked at some techniques in the AI realm called clustering. We found that there was some benefit to that. One of the things that kind of did things in that buffer profile range that DDMRP has developed. But we also saw that we were getting inconsistent results and less predictability than we were looking for. So we've started to shift more towards item level settings. And we had a prototype that we shared at our 23 user conference that was showing improving results, but still a lot of work to be done. And what we had learned by that point was that there was a lot more to this story. To really gain confidence in the recommendations of the solution, we need to make sure that we've got true fidelity or, integration with all the master settings and the like. One of the other things we found is we've got to get to where we're not simulating things that have bad data. So we focused on building out a data exception platform within the software. And the idea there is the following. If there's noise in the data and I show you a simulation of the results you could get, you're going to immediately discredit it because you know that there's something wrong with that picture. And you'll see it actually in the simulation itself. And so we found the need to build out a data exceptions platform. I'll show you that when we get started in the demo. We also recognize that we really needed to be aligned to all the calendar dimensions. What is our operating calendar? Are we using a feature called planning calendars where you can only order on certain days in the week? Any of the other system settings. At the time in our initial foray into this effort, we had two strategies for min-max. A lot of companies in the MRO space have a lot of difficulty with the real slow movers. And so we thought having a two-tier min-max approach, one for higher runners and one for lower runners, might be useful, but it was more complicated and it wasn't creating value for us. So we kind of abandoned that and went to the single min-max option. And part of that was because we saw that in that slower moving arena, having a way to generate min-max values for the client would also enhance the value of the solution in their environments. Through all the research that we were doing, we really found that the way to build these settings has to be based on a view of the historical demand for the items. Historical demand, your actual shipments and the like, tends to be a much noisier signal with more volatility than forecasts will be. Forecasts tend to get smoothed out. They're done in weekly or monthly buckets, so they've already kind of built in some normalization to begin with. And so we felt that utilizing the historical demonstrated pattern of how the consumption of a given item happens over time would be the right way to go. We also need to initialize, have initialization logic for the simulations that are used to verify that the settings we're getting are accurate. We had to have a place to start the simulation. We're looking back over a year of demand history, and we went through a bunch of iterations to fine tune that. And I think we're very comfortable with the way the simulation or initialization works. And then also how we measure results. And I'll show you this when we get into the demo as well, because you have to have a valid time window to verify that, yeah, during that period, we're getting the right results. And there are some reasons why you have to clip off the beginning of this scenario and the end due to lead times and other factors that come into play. We also saw that you can't just look historically, right? So while we're going to recognize the demand pattern itself from the historical demand, we're also going to want to verify against S&OP, and I'll show you some examples where that proves to be quite useful. What that means is that we're going to use a forecast to test the setting as well. So not only are we going to generate it based on the historical demand, we're also going to do a validation against future expected demand to ensure that it comes up with the right results. And then more granular control for the users of the base autopilot settings to give them more confidence in that they're setting it up in a manner that's going to work for them. So we really tackled all of those factors that I just mentioned over the last couple of years. It's been a long journey, but we're really confident with what we've produced. And we're continuing obviously to evaluate and gain feedback as clients are adopting and deploying out the platform in their own environments. So with that, we're going to jump over to the demonstration. All right. I talked about data exceptions. So this is the data exceptions arena in the Intuiflow product. What it's doing is looking across a range of different data exceptions that we think are relevant. Obviously, outlier demands are a critical one because there may be a story for that. Every client we've seen has got some level of outlier activity in it, whether it was a fat finger on a cycle count adjustment or some other factor like that. There's noise in the data. And if we can set these items aside until we resolve the data exceptions that they've got, then at least we can have confidence that the items that we are going to show autopilot recommendations for are going to be valuable. In this case, we've got a lot of items that have a demand history less than the MOQ. And why is that an exception? Well, it's really a call out to say that if in a year's worth of consumption you have less than what you're ordering on average, maybe you ought to go look at that. Maybe there's a way to get that MOQ down to a lower level so that you're not inheriting so much inventory holding during that time. We have some outliers that we've detected in this case. There's other demand data distortions like no lead time. There is no historical demand. We don't have a minimum order quantity or what's called an order cycle, which would be how frequently do we want to order this item. Maybe it's a new part demand pattern, meaning there's no demand and then some demand just in the last couple months. If we simulate that, it's going to look a little odd over a 52-week horizon. So let's set that aside for further evaluation and maybe run a special case around that. Similarly, you've got the expired part pattern where a lot of demand and then it just drops off the end of the world. Looks like it went out of service. Let's hold those off to the side so that we don't get results that don't make sense to you as a user as you go through. So that's what data exceptions is there for. As you get these cleaned up, then you're in a position to start to take advantage of those. And I need to move my Zoom control somehow, some way here. So with that, we'll go to the settings. Here we go. We're going to go to site admin. And this has to do with how do we set up the autopilot feature to work. It's one of the settings. You can modify these at each location if you need to, but pretty much everyone runs with a similar pattern. For each of 3 service levels, you set what your service level goal is, and you set what the demand pulse threshold is. So in other words, I want to make sure I've got constant availability for any item that has 30 demand pulses in the past 52 weeks that you can see down here. If they've got more than 30 pulses, then I want to try to make sure I've got constant availability. That's how I can serve the market the best. When I have that threshold, I have the option of saying, I only want those buffered, or I only want min-max, or I'm going to follow whatever autopilot recommends because it's going to test both the DDMRP buffer strategy against a min-max strategy for you to see which one generates the best result. And so in this case, the run we did on autopilot for this demonstration, we're letting autopilot tell us which ones to utilize. But for example, like in that MRO situation that I talked about, you might set this down to 1 pulse a year, and you might say, I only want min-maxes on this, and it would generate those values for you. You could set your service level targets accordingly for each of these ranges. Maybe you might even make it a little bit lower if you've got some real slow movers where your customers will wait for a while. So the good news is you've got some flexibility in terms of how you're configuring this to give you those recommendations. You can choose that, hey, I only want buffered on the top item or which min-max on the lower thresholds. Totally up to you. You have the option to include forecast validation. So this means that if you've got the S&OP module, it will do the forward simulations and validate whether the historical view of the red zone factors was the right one to utilize. You can set an upper limit. In this case, 5 times the usage of over the lead time is the maximum red zone we want to see. If I raise that higher, it would give us more headroom, but obviously that comes as a large cost of holding a lot of inventory in your red zone. So you want to be judicious about that. You have the ability to then further compensate by adding additional safety under the red zone. Why do we do this? Well, the algorithms and the logic in autopilot are to achieve the desired service level while at the same time minimizing the inventory. So at some points, it may look like you're flying pretty close to the ground for a day or two because of the demand pattern that item experiences. If you want to have a little further safety cushion under that, you simply add this percentage in and it builds that into the red zone size you end up with. You can look back how far you want to look back and start, and then how many weeks you want to simulate. So you could look back, hey, I want to go back 78 weeks, but I'm only going to simulate forward from there 52 weeks. That's one option, a number of different choices that you've got available for you. And then you set the ranges for what is a new part definition and what's an expired part definition. These are the base settings that are then going to drive the logic and the efforts in the autopilot as you go through. Okay. So with that, we'll go over to the autopilot. Now, this is a screen that has the ability to have multiple save views. So I've set it up with items per each of the production lines. I'm looking at make items in this case. When I open up this panel, I can see that I've got a group of 9 items that are in this group that run on this production line. I see what my current inventory levels are. I see what my target inventory levels will be based on autopilot. And I see that I'm hitting 100% service level. In this case, all 9 of these items ended up being better performed with a DDMRP buffer. And you can see here in S&OP validation says they all pass kind of the S&OP validation step. And that's how we ended up with them being in a buffered situation. If you had items that were in a min-max configuration, it would be illustrated here. Items that were non-buffered would not be included. So this is real handy because as you go through each of the different lines, you'll see kind of what the summary level results were for those. Here we see another good inventory reduction. Got a few that ended up on min-max in that case, but just a couple of them. And then line 3, the other production line, again, a nice inventory improvement, kind of a more wider mix between min-max and buffered on that group. We'll go back to the line 1 items here. When we go to the item itself, we can see the various part properties. In this case, we're using a conventional DDMRP style buffer right now. We've run autopilot to get its recommendations. We can see its buffer sizing, which shows what its expected average inventory would be and its days of coverage. We can see the bill of material, and obviously we've got buffers down on the labels, concentrate and preforms in this SKU. So each of those would be candidates for getting autopilot settings as well. And then we have the autopilot settings themselves. So in this case, we're categorizing the 100% service level. We see that the buffer is the one that gets the best results. And what we're showing here is the actual demand history that we were evaluating. So you can see this has got quite a bit of recurring demand, a little bit of hockey stick going on at the end of weeks and some pulses and clusters. Maybe those are promotional events and the like. But it's got a fair bit of volatility in terms of its demand history performance. The next graphic down shows the result of the S&OP or the forecast validation. And you can see that we've got the average inventory line here between the two. And we've got about 9,500 here, 93, 9,400 on the S&OP validation. It was choosing DDMRP buffer for this one because the performance was slightly better on the historical. They both passed the S&OP validation, so we're good to go with those settings. And this is showing you the actual results. Now, you'll notice that this gray window here is overlaying the graphic. This goes back to showing the validation period for the actual results. We have to offset based on the lead time of the item at the start of it, because we have to prime the pump, if you will, to show how the item would start up if we just had started buffering. And so we kind of exclude that first lead time so that proper demand, supply, and inventory is being created. And then at the end, we're going to cut off the last, in this case, it's about 13 weeks because we are using forecasted rates of demand for the sizing of these buffers. You can see that there's some seasonality to their period, and that client would elect to use a forward rate of usage to size its buffer. And that's what this window is doing. It's using that to validate the results period that we're utilizing in determining the right settings. And you can see your average inventory lines here. It would also say what your result would be with your current settings, meaning I showed you that we're using a standard DDMRP kind of buffer configuration, buffer profile configuration. And if we had actual performance results, it would contrast those with your actual performance. And why are we doing this? Well, we'd like to show you that, hey, if you follow these recommendations, utilize these settings, you get a better view of the improvement opportunities that you've got available for you. And these evolved a lot through client feedback. The idea here is that if users are leery of the black box syndrome and not sure whether that's going to give them the right results, then maybe by utilizing these graphics, we can gain confidence because not only do you see the actual demand pulse pattern, but you're going to see an illustration of a simulation using the setting that the system is recommending that validates that, in fact, you're going to have good inventory performance. We're not stocking out. We've got plenty of safety coverage underneath us. And in fact, we're getting better results than what we've been able to achieve up till this point. And I think this is really, really important to be able to have that confidence that the settings that we're getting are going to give us the right kind of results. Now, there's another feature in the software that allows us to further evaluate this, and it's called our S&OP module, where we can utilize a part simulation. In this case, we've run a simulation using the conventional setting that this buffer is on, and we can also then test it against its autopilot settings. And you'll see graphs that look very similar to what we were looking at. You can see that same service level evaluation window coming into play here. We can use that. We can compare it to the min-max setting and run that simulation. And we can test other parameters. What if we change the order cycle from being 14 days up to 28 days? We can rerun that simulation and we'll see that it'll change our inventory results. We'll see a fatter green zone. We can utilize this as a further way to allow us to gain confidence by testing that the settings that we're utilizing are going to give us good results, and also to factor in other elements like green zone sizes, our lead times, other elements that also have an influence on getting the right results. The feedback we've gotten from clients has been this is really, really helpful. Obviously, if you've got 1,000 parts to manage, you're not going to go one by one through all of them utilizing this simulation tool. You're going to look at your heavy runners perhaps and test them in this kind of a tool itself. But more than anything, what you're trying to do is get a visual reinforcement that, yeah, I've got the right results. Then obviously, as we go through time, you can update your autopilot settings perhaps once a month by just pressing a button and they get generated and implemented into the part attributes and the like. So it's a very low maintenance effort to do that. It's going to allow you to keep in touch with any evolving changes in your demand history and obviously the overall conditions in the environment. So that was the idea of what we wanted to share with you today. The autopilot feature itself has got a great UI. It gives you summary results about what your improvement opportunities are. You can see buffered versus min-max. In most cases, the results are really pretty competitive and close to each other from that standpoint. Every now and then you'll see some that have a significant outlier. Some of the times, like on those items that have a lot of seasonality, min-max is going to be more exposed in that environment because it's kind of a static buffer. Or if you're using it in an autopilot, it would be somewhat dynamic, but maybe once a month you're going to update your min-max settings. But then again, on those slower moving items, having the ability to update and maintain those on a frequent basis is quite handy. I'm going to stop the screen share just for a moment so I can bring it back up the presentation. Okay, and we'll go back to the presentation. And at this point, we're going to ask the follow-up polling question. So let me bring up the poll. We have 2 more questions to ask you here. Okay, 2 more questions, and then we're going to wrap up. Wait a few more seconds here so the rest of you can get your responses in. Okay, thanks so much. We'll share the results. So delighted to see 93% feel that they are confident that the autopilot feature will give us improved safety stock settings. Really appreciate that. There's a little bit of concern there, and we would love to have a follow-up discussion to understand why not. Uh, and so we'll hopefully be able to get in touch with individuals on that side of the fence, but eager to get any further feedback. The goal here is gain trust and confidence in the system. And, I've got a real commitment to trying to really bring that to life because I think that's what the software should be all about. And then real high confidence that the visual elements are going to help us build that user confidence. That's the end game here. If we can get to where users can trust the system, we are taking a big, big step forward. It's to me a shame that so often what we see is that users are in a mode where they're checking the math of the computer. And that's because they don't trust it. They don't trust the settings. They're pulling data into Excel. They're doing whatever they need to do to try to get through the day. And that seems like a shame. If, all the money that they've put into in the market into ERP systems and supply chain planning solutions, you would think that we would make some of these day-to-day kind of items a lot easier to deal with and more manageable for you as an end user. So with that, I'm going to stop. Oops, sorry. Are you still seeing the poll, by the way?
Yes.
Okay, hang on. Just give me a second.
No, it's gone now.
Okay, good. Thanks, Tim. All right, back
We
to
do
the
have a
present.
couple of questions.
Okay, we'll get to those in a minute. One of the other areas that we're looking at is there's another factor that we didn't talk a lot about, which is lead time horizons, or the ADU horizons, rather. When you're setting up a stock buffer, you have to have a horizon to determine what my rate of usage has been. The longer that horizon, the more stable the ADU value will become. The shorter horizon, the more sensitive it becomes. And there's a lot of questions that have been around the DDMRP circles and others that say, hey, what's the right number to utilize? And so we've been doing research on this area. And the tendency has been that longer horizons tend to be better. That even though there's value in a dynamic buffer, you want to be careful about being too dynamic. And so our research is showing us that longer horizons, a lot of people have been using like a 90 to 120 day horizon and the like, seems to be pretty good. These are different service levels. These are the required inventory at that ADU horizon. As the horizons got longer, the results tended to get better. And that showed up in different demand kind of patterns and the like. You can see here a little more randomized, a little more strong case for the longer horizons. What we also learned is something you don't want to do. If I have 180-day cycles between peak demand periods, the last thing I want to do is have a 90-day trailing horizon because I'm always going to be out of phase. So this is another area that we're starting to do some work on with the intent of providing some further, automation around how do I get to the right settings for factors like the ADU horizon and the like. Um, the goal is trust in the system. We can trust in the system and we can get to more automated planning where things are on auto approval because we know we've got the settings right. Then we can take our hands off the wheel a little bit and allow users to focus onto the more challenging things like, how do we bring a new vendor into the fray here? How do we deal with a vendor changeover? How do we resolve supply constraints that have existed in our environment and whatnot? The job of the planner and the user should be a lot more than just pushing the button and approving the orders or checking the math. It should be more focused on that richer content that is so important to get done and often takes second seat to all of the other priorities that get in the way. The visual proof is there to help gain that confidence. I appreciate the confidence that you all have expressed in the polling results there. We think it's a big step forward over the inherent limitations of statistical methods. We know from the data, from all the research we've done, that statistics alone are not the full answer. So that the goal here is to give us a more holistic approach. And obviously, from an implementation of a new technology such as this, it's a good idea to use a phase-in approach so that users can gain confidence, bring in kind of the steady runners, they can get into the more difficult ones. This is the third kind of generation of autopilot with all the enhancements we've been making based on all the feedback that we've been getting. So we think we've really started turning the curve or corner here in terms of a real stable platform, getting us the right kind of results and doing with a lot of visual representation. And I'll send it on this and then we'll take the questions. I mean, my goodness, if human beings can engineer the ability to land a rocket in a chopstick catcher like SpaceX is doing, my goodness, that thing's got 33 rocket engines in it. How in the world are they doing that? If that's possible, and we've seen it demonstrated many times, then my goodness, we should be able to do a lot more for supply chain users to have a lot more user-friendly, easy to work with, and safe kind of environments to be to working in. So with that, let's see what kind of questions we've got. Here we go. Hang on. Why is there such a push for min-max over DDMRP buffer? So in the examples we shared today, most of the items were ended up in buffering, in DDMRP buffer. And I think the reason why there's times when min-max works is I think effectively that's like a static buffer. And it goes back to that lead time comment that I was showing you. Longer horizons for our daily usage tend to be more stable, and we tend to get slightly better results. And so I don't think it's an indictment of DDMRP in any way at all. I think it's more a reflection that in certain dynamic environments, you may be better off with a min-max threshold. But you've got the ability in the software now to, if you just want to choose dynamic buffering, you can do that. And that's one of those settings that I illustrate in the site admin area. The example that you saw where the buffer was tapering down at the end, that's because that item was using a forecasted rate of usage. And as you get to the end of the simulation horizon, there's no forecast beyond that. So it's reducing its FDU size. And that's why we utilize that horizon window. I could show you that here again. Sorry, I went to the wrong screen. Hopefully I can grab this guy. Yeah. If you look at this item here, you can see in our simulations that I guess maybe it was in part simulation. Okay, we'll go back to the base setting here. And we'll get rid of this. This was 14 days, I think. Suffice to say, I don't know where that was in the illustration, but if you're on an FDU at the end of the year, it's settling down because there is no forecast beyond that. And that's why you see that showing up that way. And that was the second question. Min-max will resize every time you rerun autopilot. In other words, it's looking at it over that 52-week trailing horizon we were utilizing, and it will set a setting based on that. But in practice, you would resize the min-max values every month that you run autopilot. And so you would get an evolving dynamic min-max, if you will, in that kind of a fashion, if that makes sense. So hopefully those answers were adequate, and I don't think we have any more. I really appreciate all of your participation in the polling and the Q&A. Our goal, obviously, here is to give you a system that's easier to use and can really be trusted to give us the kind of results that you all are looking for in your material management arena. So with that, again, we'll send out a link to the recording and a copy of the webinar presentation. Thanks so much for your interest today, and we look forward to helping you as we go forward. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.